I just watched two videos by this individual here, and the point of these videos, it seems, is to minimize the racial aspects of slavery in the United States of America. And I don't understand this. I have to ask, what is the point? There is no way to mitigate the racial foundations of slavery in the United States or to deflect blame away from white people. There simply isn't. Now, this YouTuber made two videos, both based on Thomas Sowell, who I've spoken of here at length before on the channel. One video about how Africans sold other Africans to whites, who then transported them to the colonies and eventually the slaveholding states. And the second one was about how white people ended slavery. And to both of these, I have to ask, so what? How does this change the fact that the foundational element of slavery in the United States, in the antebellum South, was white supremacy and the belief that Africans were inferior to whites and were created by God to be slaves? The entire legal system of the slaveholding states was based on and created with white supremacy and all of this idea of black inferiority as its core. Now, I use this book as reference a lot, An Inquiry into the Law of Negro Slavery in the United States of America. And why do I use this book? Because it can be understood as the Bible of antebellum slave law. It was written by Thomas R.R. Cobb, and he was known as the James Madison of the Confederacy for his work writing the Confederate Constitution. He was one of the most famous jurists in the antebellum South. He was the main author of the Georgia Code of 1861, the laws of the state of Georgia. So this was a very important person. This writing was so important, in fact, that in 1861, the Alabama State Supreme Court went out of its way to cite and argue against a point he made in this writing in one of their judicial opinions, which shows how the Alabama Supreme Court believed that this treatise was too important for the court to ignore. Now, they disagreed with him on this issue of manumission in a previous Alabama case, but the point still remains that the Alabama Supreme Court knew they had to address this because of how important this treatise was and how many jurists in the antebellum South knew of it, referenced it, and were aware of it. So let's ask the first question. Did Cobb know that blacks were selling other blacks into slavery? The answer is yes, of course he did. Now, does that undermine the racial and white supremacist foundation of slavery in the United States? No. Cobb writes, quote, "We cannot go back to the origins of Negro slavery. We have seen that the earliest authentic histories and monuments exhibit the Negro in a state of bondage. It is not our purpose to describe the oppressive slavery to which the Negro is subjected in his own land at the hand of his fellows. Both master and slave being barbarians, we could expect to find only the most savage and cruel forms of slavery," end quote. So right there, he states that both black slaves and black enslavers were barbarians, right? So clearly he doesn't have a high view of Africans and people of African descent, even those who enslaved other Africans. He continued, quote, "The origins of the system of slavery is found, therefore, in the purchase of persons already in a state of slavery in their own land. The law recognizes the rights of the master there to sell and sustain the title of the purchaser from him," end quote. So where's the secret? Where was it hidden from any educated person in the antebellum South that blacks sold other blacks as slaves to whites? I also don't know about the education this person received, but this was taught to me in school. And I mean like secondary school, right, in high school, possibly even in middle school social studies. This wasn't a surprise at any point in my education that it randomly come up in higher ed or in law school or in my journey into antebellum slave law. So clearly, Cobb was aware that blacks sold other blacks into slavery. And let's see how he worked with this to build on the white supremacist foundation of antebellum slave law. So again, how does this fact that whites purchase black slaves from other blacks mitigate the racial foundations of slavery in the United States? Do you know why whites purchased black slaves from other Africans? Because it was easy. because whites couldn't go into the African continent themselves. It was known as the white man's graveyard due to disease. But again, and I'm going to beat this horse to death, how does this fact take away from the fact that Cobb, other jurists, medical professionals, religious authorities, and scientists believed that blacks were meant to be slaves and not whites? Regardless of where these black slaves were bought from, purchased from, or taken from, they were meant to be slaves. Whites were not. Cobb makes this clear that whites were not supposed to be slaves, that whites couldn't be slaves, claiming that slavery is the natural state for blacks, not for whites. He compared how studying in a library is a natural state for a German student, meaning a white person, but if you put a Native American in that same library and had them study, it would do violence to the law of nature, since that is not the natural place for a Native American. He wrote, quote, and some of this is absurd, I understand this, but this was a highly respected, if not one of the most respected jurists in the Antebellum South, and this was read by all the prominent people who created and maintained the system. So this is insane, and I get that, but he wrote, quote, slavery may be utterly inconsistent with the law of nature when applied to one race of men, and yet perfectly consistent with the nature of others, end quote. He also made the point in this writing that whites could not enslave other whites because white people, being physically, intellectually, and morally equal to each other, slavery would do violence to their nature rather than to help and perfect them. You can't perfect me if we're equals, therefore slavery has no benefit to me. Therefore, slavery could only be natural if it benefited the enslaved, and this could only happen if the enslaved were of an inferior race to the enslaver. You see where this is going? To prove this point, Cobb noted that the Negro is fit for the condition of servitude, his black skin giving him endurance during the heat of summer, during the long summers. He noted that Africans are mentally inferior, and that it is the white man's duty to cultivate and improve Africans. He went so far as to say that the mental inferiority of the Negro is agreed upon by every distinguished naturalist. Morally, Cobb noted that the Negro was morally degraded as seen with the barbarous tribes in Africa, and because of this, he wrote that their humanity has even been doubted. Cobb proudly declared, quote, the inference would seem irresistible from the testimony of this volume that the most successful engine for the development of the Negro intellect is slavery. In mental and moral development, slavery, so far from retarding, has advanced the Negro race, but remove the restraining and controlling power of the master, and the Negro becomes at once a slave of his lust and the victim of his indolence, relapsing with wonderful rapidity into his pristine barbarism. The important truth is before us from history that contact with the Caucasian is the only civilizer of the Negro, and slavery the only condition which that contact can be preserved. And consequently, slavery as it exists in the United States is not contrary to the law of nature, end quote. So where, my friends, good viewers, in all of that, do we see anything other than slavery in the U.S. was based on white supremacy, and the natural condition of a black person is to be a slave? How does the fact that Africans sold other Africans into this system as slaves to whites in some way mitigate any of this, or mitigate white people's responsibility for creating the system of African slavery in the antebellum South? But now I want you to ask yourself, so this is a treatise on law, right? This is a book on law. It cites hundreds and hundreds of cases. But everything I've just read comes before he even gets into all the nitty-gritty issues of slave law. So ask, why did he go to such great lengths to explain to the reader? Now remember, who were the readers of this book? Who would have picked this book off the shelf to read it? They would have been attorneys. They would have been judges. They would have been lawmakers. That's whom this treatise, this book was written for. So this was the upper class, the ruling class, the enslavers. Why did he go to these great lengths to prove that black people should be slaves? Because the law required him to. So you see, in 1772, before the creation of the United States, there was the British case of Somerset v. Stewart. And to make a long story short, a slave was taken by his master to London, where he promptly ran away. He was caught and a trial for his freedom was held. The judge, Lord Mansfield, wrote in his opinion that, quote, "The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political, but only by positive law. It is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law," end quote. So what he meant by this was that slavery is so unnatural that it could only exist if a law was on the books saying that slavery was legal, right? It goes so against nature that it cannot exist without a law saying you can have slaves. That was the decision of Lord Mansfield. Since there was no such law in England, the man was set free. The problem, and this was a big problem for the colonies, which would eventually become the states, because there was no positive law allowing for slavery in any of the states, except for one. There was a positive law in Georgia because at one point Georgia had made slavery illegal, and then it needed to make it legal again, so it had to have a law on the books saying that you could have slaves. So Cobb and other jurists went out of their way to show that since Africans were inferior mentally, they were barbarians in their native land, and they were physically created by God for slavery, then no positive law was needed because it was the natural place of the African race. No other race, no other group of people. Cobb argued that there was no requirement for a positive law. The enslavement of Africans was not odious. It didn't go against the law of nature. It, in fact, is their natural place, their natural condition. Therefore, no positive law was required. So again, this is a system built entirely on white supremacy. And again, I ask, how does the fact that Africans sold other Africans to whites as slaves undermine any of this?